Hey everybody, it's Kim at Middle of the Book March, and I didn't do an intro because I wanted to give the majority of my time to the content of this particular video. This is the results video for Nonfiction Group B in the semifinals of the Booktube Prize. Not the results video, my results video. I should script myself, I should write it out, or just put a little bit more effort into creating content, but no, I won't. I'm putting in exactly the right amount of effort, so I'm still having fun, and hopefully you're still enjoying it as well. So I'm going to tell you how I ranked the 6 books in my group, which was Nonfiction Group B. There were only 2 because it was the semifinals. And lo and behold, I had to read all 6 of the books, but I did it, and I think I did it pretty well. I actually read them pretty quickly. So typically I do a combination of print book, audiobook, ebook, and that's what helps me read all of the books that I need to read within a certain length of time. So let's get going. I'm going to go from my least favorite to my most favorite. And just in case you noticed, I got new bookcases for my birthday. Behind me in this room, there used to be dark brown bookcases. Those were kind of those cheesy particle board, and they were falling apart. So those got discarded, and I have 2 of these. There's another one over there. They're solid wood with kind of a beadboard background, and which I really love. I have a few more of these in my dining room. So that was my birthday present, family present to me, or present to myself, who cares? So let me tell you what I thought of these books. Least favorite to most favorite. Number 6 was very obvious from the very beginning, and this is Strangers to Ourselves, Unsettled Minds and the Stories That Make Us by Rachel Aviv. I thought this book was crap, and I think it was billed as how we understand ourselves in periods of crisis and distress. It's a book about mental health and mental illness, and it's basically a collection or a series of short biographies, almost in an essay format. And it's the author talks about herself, and then she also talks about an additional 5 other people, one of whom she goes back to at the end of the book. I don't know what this book was trying to do. The stories are supposed to be personal stories, and they were easy to read. The topic was very vague. She starts off talking about herself. As a 6-year-old child, she was diagnosed with anorexia. I don't know how that happens. I don't know much about eating disorders, so I can't like wrap my brain around the fact that a 6-year-old girl is diagnosed with anorexia. I don't know how that works. But she's discussing her signs and symptoms, and to me, she had a chaotic family and a chaotic childhood, and I don't think she actually had anorexia, and I think she kind of goes back and analyzes her past and realizes I may not have had anorexia. So that's her launching off point. But after that, it's like, what is tying all of these stories together? Nothing. They're all depictions of people with a mental illness, and how that defines their lives, and how that adds to their identities. And I think that's the biggest point. I think that's what she was trying to display, is how does having a mental illness add to or create or detract from your identity? I didn't care. Who cares? Is it kind of this existential question? I don't know. I didn't get that. I didn't care if that was the point of the book. I thought it was weak, and yeah, put that one aside. And fortunately, that was the shortest book, so I got done with that pretty quickly. My book in number 5 was his name is George Floyd, One Man's Life and Struggle for Racial Justice, written by Robert Samuels and Toulouse Olorunnipa. George Floyd as a person and as a contemporary historical figure has at this point become an icon of racial justice and police brutality and murder by the police, and a black man's plight in white America, and how they have to live with the culture of the police department as it exists currently. However, the life of George Floyd as a person, as an individual, does not give enough foundational material to create a whole book around his biography. And that's nothing against him as a person. I hate to use the word humanize, and I think the book and some reviews talk about it humanizes George Floyd. But that's wrong, because he was already a human. You don't have to humanize a human. He was not a mystical, mythological, created figure. He was an actual man who was murdered on the streets by a police officer. And that alone, that event, is worthy of analysis and is worthy of commentary. But to go back and look into Floyd's life and build up this nonfiction work, I don't think it worked. There wasn't enough meat there. And I think the authors also went into talking about racial justice and police brutality and the Black Lives Matter movement. And they did a lot of discussion and magnifying those topics at the same time. But what they did do for George Floyd was to give the reader a glimpse into who he was, with all of his faults and his flaws and his mistakes. But quite honestly, he was loved. He was valued by his friends and family. He had a wide circle of people who cared very deeply for him. And he was prematurely ripped from the world by a racist white police officer. So it was a difficult book and a difficult topic in long form. There just wasn't enough there to write a bio, I think. Let's see, the next one is The Escape. This is number 4, The Escape Artist, The Man Who Broke Out of Auschwitz to Warn the World by Jonathan Friedland. I listened to this on audio, and the audio production was excellent. It was the content that I had issue with. The story itself is fascinating. He's talking about a teenager who had been taken as a prisoner to Auschwitz, ends up hiding and escaping from the concentration camp. And that in itself is a miracle. I want to hear that guy's story. However, as I was listening, there were certain things that would come on the audio and I'd be like, what? Wait a minute. Some inconsistencies throughout the text, throughout the content. And then I started to listen to the author narrates it. I started to listen to what the author was saying. And there were some things that didn't jive with me, so I looked things up, and there were some blatant inaccuracies in what he was talking about. This was a book about a young man who escaped Auschwitz, and according to the author, he was the only one who successfully escaped, or one of just a handful of people who escaped Auschwitz successfully and lived to tell the world, but that wasn't true. And it's very easy to do the research and find out that wasn't really true. He was possibly the most well-known to have done it. But yeah, his story is a miracle though, and it's also infuriating because after he did escape Auschwitz, he brought this information to the world's governments. He sat for hours and hours of interviews and debriefings and downloading of all of the information he had and that he shared with the authorities. And they moved so slowly in disbelief of his story. And that was maddening and infuriating. The book reads like a thriller, which at first was fun and interesting and had me captivated, but the author is a thriller writer. He's not a historian. He's not that great of a researcher. So the style of writing was good. The content was questionable. So that's why that book ended up at number 4 for me. Number 3, we are now in the top 3. This was rough. The 2 and 3 and possibly 4 and 5, all of them I could have thrown them in a bucket and picked one out for each one of them. But eventually as I was thinking more and more and analyzing how I felt along the way, I realized certain books are sliding themselves into a specific position. And this book was definitely number 3. And this one is Sandy Hook. An American Tragedy and the Battle for Truth by Elizabeth Williamson. This is not a book about Sandy Hook per se and the massacre of children, 21 children and 6 adults at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Sandy Hook, Connecticut. It is not, the entire book is not a historical account of that event. There is definite material in the first third or so of the book that talks about what happened, talks about what led up to that event, talks about the effects on the community, the effects on the families of the children and the staff who were gunned down. It is very difficult to read. There are times when I just had to put it down. I read the book on ebook because I could not bring myself to buy a physical copy and have that in my home. I couldn't do it. And when I think back to when the event at Sandy Hook actually happened, it was traumatizing to so many families in that whole town. And I can remember feeling the grief and mourning the loss of innocence of those precious children and everybody who went to school that day thinking it was just going to be a regular day. So there is a lot of background on the event itself. And then she does a lot of interviews of the families and the parents. But the majority of the book is talking about all of the conspiracy theories surrounding Sandy Hook and the quote-unquote media personality Alex Jones from InfoWars, who is a despicable excuse for a human being. He's an example of a person that can't be humanized. He's just despicable. And so much of the book talks about what he encouraged other white nationalist, ultra right-wing conservative, conspiracy theorist encouraging people to do and to think. The families of these children were harassed. They were threatened with death. They were threatened with violence. It was abhorrent what happened to them. One father killed himself after his child was shot and killed at Sandy Hook, and he couldn't deal with the pressure and the anguish and the torment of the people who came after him, telling him that it was all fake. It was all staged by the government. All the conspiracy theories of, how does the government expect us to believe this without evidence of these children's bodies? We want to see bodies. We want to see pictures. We want to see pictures of the massacre site. I was beside myself emotionally. I had to put it down back and forth because it was just a lot to digest. But Williamson goes into detail about what she thinks about Alex Jones, which is fine. I totally 100% agree with her. But in this context, in this book, I wanted more research and more journalism instead of political leanings and her opinions on Alex Jones as a horrible person. She does a lot of interviews with his followers, with some of his main followers, and she also follows his litigation and the legal cases and the court cases and what the parents had to go through to sit through these proceedings and relive their children's last moments before their murders. It's very clear what she thinks politically. She doesn't hold any punches. She uses a lot of language that I wouldn't necessarily put into a professional piece of nonfiction like this, but there are times I couldn't blame her. A lot of it got redundant because Alex Jones would resort to the same tactics over and over and over again. Okay, I get it. And there was a lot of, wading through the weeds in the mud of his histrionics and his actions that he perpetrated against these suffering families. It was absolutely awful. So that was number 3. I think she did a great job at the research. She's a great writer. There was just some issues with that for me. But it is number 3, so it was in my top 3. We are at number 2. I had very, very high hopes for this book. It was okay. It was mostly really good, but it made me sad because I didn't love it as much as I wanted to. This is An Immense World by Ed Yong, and this is just, this premise is fascinating and so unique and interesting. How animal sentences reveal the hidden realms around us. He's writing about how animal senses differ from human senses, and how we always assume dogs and cats see the same way we do. They hear, they smell differently, we understand that, but we try to relate their senses to ours, and that's incorrect and inaccurate, because the levels of animal senses are so much different than humans. He goes into hundreds of different kinds of animals. That became overwhelming. He narrates the audio, and I did a combination. His audio is excellent. He's a great audio narrator. You can tell how passionate and how interested he is in his topic. He has an enormous amount of research, but that was one of my problems, was there's an overwhelming amount of information. A lot of it is very scientific, and I kind of blew through that because I wouldn't have had time to understand it without doing a lot of work on my part, which I was not prepared to do. But I did remember so many different things, especially how many eyes a scallop has. Here I am thinking they're just delicious, but the amount of eyes that thing has, the different location systems that birds use, or dolphins use, or bats, what insects, how insects see and taste and hear. It's incredible. But yeah, this book was a little overwhelming for me. Exceptionally well written. He does get funny in a lot of places. This is a book you could put on audio and listen to with your kids in the car, and it would be educational for them too. It was a little much for me, but very well done. So eventually, number one rose to the top, and it was very clear to me that this book was going to be number one. This is Under the Skin by Linda Villarosa, The Hidden Toll of Racism on the American Lives and on the Health of Our Nation. This is an excellent book. It started off a little choppy, but after that, it was like, it flew. And this is an excellent example of firsthand accounts, of interviews, of conversations, of her hanging out with the subject of the text, of her, spending time with people, of her looking into different examples of racism in medical care and healthcare. I was just floored. She talks about Serena Williams and her pregnancy and the fact that she almost died because the doctors would not listen to her, and they just chalked it up to a kind of a histrionic black woman, and she could have died had her husband, who was white, not forced them to pay attention to what she was telling them. She does talk about women who have lost their lives in childbirth, black women, because they just were not paid attention to. She talks about the health care her own father received after a heart attack at the VA, and this is a post heart attack, which had been yet undiagnosed, minor heart attack, but he was treated like a child, and then as a black man ignored until somebody finally got to him, even though he was a veteran. She talks about her own experience of childbirth with her child, and none of it's not positive. I think her daughter was at low birth weight, as was Serena Williams' daughter, as were so many children of black women, born prematurely, born small, and it's the conclusion she comes to is it's because of the inherent racism that black women and black people needing healthcare live with. The levels of blood pressure issues, of high blood pressure, of cardiac issues, of anemia, of all different illnesses and ailments that strike black people at much higher, what's the word I'm looking for? Instances is the best thing I can think of, than they do white people. But when you have an entire section of black people in this country who have to live under racial stress in every area of their life, it causes health issues. And not only does it cause the health issues, but they don't have the same opportunities to the same level of health care that white people do. And this was an excellent book. Again, just some sections so hard to read, and it makes you furious what people have to go through. So, extremely well written. She's an excellent writer. Really, really enjoyed reading that book. So those are my results for Nonfiction Group B for the semifinals in the Booktube Prize. Let me know what you think below. Keep an eye out, and let's see which ones of these had gone on to the finals. By now, I believe the video is already out. So I'm interested to see how many books I have to read in the final. We'll see, only a couple, I think. Let me know in the comments below what you think, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye, everybody.